What if one single bean plant could keep handing you a fresh harvest, week after week, for months, while your neighbor's beans came and went in a single flush and then just sat there done? That is exactly the difference we are working with today. Some beans give you one big burst of pods and then quietly stop. Others just keep going, flowering and fruiting again and again until frost finally shuts them down. Today I am going to show you how to set up a small space container system built entirely around that second kind, so you get pods that never really stop coming. Let's start with the container itself, because in a small space, the container is doing more work than people realize. I like using a fabric grow bag for this setup, and there is a real reason for that choice beyond just convenience. Fabric lets air reach the roots from every side, which naturally prunes them and stops that tangled, root-bound mess you get in a plastic pot. It also drains fast, so you are not fighting soggy soil after every watering. If you have ever grown beans in a glazed ceramic pot and watched the soil stay wet for days, you already know the problem. That trapped moisture sits right at the base of the stem and invites root rot before the plant even gets going. For a climbing variety, you want real depth and real width. Aim for something in the range of 8 to 12 inches deep and about 18 inches across. That might sound generous for a small space setup, but climbing beans put on a lot of vine and a lot of pods, and a shallow pot will dry out on you by mid-afternoon in the middle of summer. Give the roots room to actually hold water and nutrients, and the plant will reward you for it. Now for the soil. A loamy potting mix with compost worked through, it gives you that balance of drainage and nutrition beans actually want, holding just enough moisture without staying waterlogged. When it comes to fertilizer, this is where a lot of people accidentally sabotage their own harvest before they even realize it. It feels natural to reach for a high nitrogen feed because nitrogen makes everything look lush and green fast, and a plant covered in big healthy leaves feels like a sign you are doing something right. But with beans, that instinct works against you. Too much nitrogen tells the plant to keep building leaves and vine instead of flowers, and flowers are what eventually become pods. So every bit of energy the plant spends on extra foliage is energy it did not spend on the thing you actually want. This is doubly true for beans specifically, because beans have their own natural way of pulling nitrogen from the air through their roots, which we will get into in a moment. So they need far less added nitrogen than most other vegetables to begin with. So instead of a high nitrogen blend, look for something lower in nitrogen and higher in phosphorus and potassium, sometimes labeled with a lower first number and higher second and third numbers on the packaging. Work a bit of that into the soil at planting time, and you are setting the plant up from day one to focus its energy where you actually want it, on blooming and fruiting, instead of just growing taller and leafier for no real benefit. If you are new here, this is exactly the kind of small space growing we do every week on this channel, practical setups that actually work in a container or a balcony, not just a big backyard. So if that is useful to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now before we keep going. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from. I genuinely love seeing how many different climates and growing zones are following along. All right, let's talk about which bean to actually plant, because this decision is the whole foundation of the never stop producing idea. Beans generally fall into a few different growth habits, and they behave in very different ways once they get going. Bush beans grow low and compact, usually somewhere between 12 and 24 inches tall, and they do not need any support at all. The trade-off is that they are what's called determinate, meaning they flower and set almost all of their pods within a fairly short window, just a few weeks. That gives you a big, satisfying harvest all at once, which is great if you want to can or preserve a large batch in one go. But it also means the plant is vulnerable. If a heat wave hits during that short blooming window, you can lose a huge portion of your harvest to blossom drop, and there is no second wave coming to make up for it. Climbing, or pole beans, work completely differently. These are what we want for this build. Pole beans are indeterminate, which just means they do not stop after one flush. They keep flowering and setting new pods continuously, all season as long as you keep harvesting and the weather cooperates. And here is the part that really matters for a never-stop producing system. Even when it gets uncomfortably hot and pollination briefly stalls, pole beans do not just give up the way bush beans can. They pause, drop a few blooms, and then pick right back up once temperatures cool off again. That resilience is exactly why a climbing variety is the backbone of this whole setup. Two varieties worth looking for are Kentucky Wonder and Kentucky Blue. Both are reliable, flavorful, long-producing pole beans that have been proven in gardens for generations, and they are widely available almost anywhere you buy seeds. They will easily climb well past head height if you let them, filling out a trellis with dense foliage and pods hanging at every level, which honestly makes for one of the most satisfying sights in a small garden. If you want something in between a bush and a full climber, a half-runner variety is worth considering too. These stay more compact, only sending out short runners of a few feet, and they do fine with just a light trellis or some twine rather than a full support structure. Varieties in that half-runner category tend to hold up especially well in hot, humid conditions, so if your summers run intense, that middle ground option is worth a look. But for the true continuous harvest we are chasing today, pole beans are the ones doing the heavy lifting, and that is what we are building this whole system around. It is worth pausing on why this distinction matters so much, because it is easy to assume all beans behave more or less the same way. They really do not. A bush variety is going to give you a wonderful, generous harvest. There is no denying that, but it behaves almost like a single event. The plant blooms, sets its pods, you harvest, and then the plant is mostly finished for the season even though it is still sitting there green and healthy looking. A pole variety treats flowering and fruiting as an ongoing process rather than a one-time event, which is exactly the behavior we want if the goal is a harvest that keeps showing up on its own schedule rather than all at once. Once you have your variety picked, timing your planting matters more than people expect. Beans hate cold, wet soil. Wait until the soil has genuinely warmed up before you sow, because seeds planted too early just sit there and rot instead of germinating. And here is a step that almost nobody talks about, but it makes a real difference in how productive your plants become over the season. Beans belong to a plant family that has this incredible relationship with a specific soil bacteria called rhizobium. When the conditions are right, this bacteria actually moves into the plant's root hairs and triggers the formation of small nodules along the roots. Inside those nodules, the bacteria goes to work pulling nitrogen straight out of the air, the same air surrounding the plant every day, and converts it into a form the bean can actually absorb and use. In exchange, the plant feeds the bacteria a bit of sugar it produces through photosynthesis. It is a genuine partnership, and honestly one of the more remarkable things happening quietly underground that most gardeners never think about. It is basically a built-in fertilizer factory living right on the roots, running for free all season long. The problem is that fresh potting soil, especially anything bagged or sterilized, usually has none of this bacteria present naturally, since it typically only builds up over years in undisturbed garden soil. Without it, your plant is stuck relying entirely on whatever nitrogen you feed it. So before you plant, lightly dampen your seeds with a little water, just enough to help things stick, and toss them in a rhizobium inoculant powder so it coats the surface evenly. Then sow them right away while the coating is still active and moist. It sounds like a small, almost forgettable step, but it gives the plant a real head start on feeding itself for the rest of the season, which directly supports that steady, continuous production we are building this entire system around. A healthy, active nodule will actually show a pink or reddish color inside if you ever dig one up to check, which is the visible sign that it is doing its job. Now let's get the support structure up, and I want to stress this part. Get it built before or right at planting time, not after. Bean roots are shallow and sensitive, and driving stakes or poles into the soil once the seedlings are established can tear right through them. For a small space, A simple string trellis against a wall or railing works beautifully. Just run vertical lines of sturdy twine from the base of your container up to a frame or a horizontal support above, spacing the lines out evenly so each seedling has its own clear path upward. If you have a bit more room, a tippy made from several poles tied together at the top and splayed out in a circle gives the vines plenty of surface area to climb while taking up almost no footprint at the base. You can build one from bamboo stakes or even trimmed branches if you have them lying around, tying them off securely about a foot from the top so the whole structure holds its shape once the wind picks up, and the vines add weight later in the season. Whichever structure you choose, the logic behind it is the same. Because these beans grow upward instead of sprawling sideways, you get dramatically more pods per square foot than any bush variety could ever give you in the same space. That is the real advantage of going vertical in a small space setup. You are not fighting for square footage. You are just building up instead. It also keeps the foliage open and airy, which matters more than people expect, since good airflow through the leaves helps keep the plant healthier and less prone to the kind of fungal issues that thrive in a tight, humid tangle of vines sitting close to wet soil. As the seedlings come up and start reaching for something to grab onto, you will notice the tendrils searching in wide little circles until they find the string or the pole. It is honestly one of my favorite things to watch in the whole process, that first moment a tendril catches hold, and you know the plant has found its path. Once they catch on, they wrap tight and start climbing fast, and within a couple of weeks you will have a wall of green where there used to be bare string. This next part is where a lot of people unknowingly stall out their own harvest, and it comes right back to that nitrogen issue we touched on earlier. As the plant grows and starts to flower, resist the urge to keep feeding it a rich, high-nitrogen fertilizer. Too much nitrogen at this stage pushes the plant to keep pouring energy into leafy vine growth instead of flowers, and every flower the plant skips is a pod you never get to harvest. Instead, apply a fertilizer that leans toward phosphorus and potassium, something low in nitrogen, right at planting, and then again once you see the first blossoms appear. That second feeding is what tells the plant to keep the flowers coming rather than shutting production down early. While we're talking about what helps the plant thrive, companion planting is worth a mention here too. Summer savory is genuinely one of the best neighbors you can give your beans. It gives off an aroma that helps keep certain pests away, and there is even some evidence it improves the flavor of the beans themselves when the two are harvested and cooked together. On the flip side, keep beans well away from anything in the onion family, so that includes onions, garlic, leeks, and shallots. Those plants release compounds into the soil that actively interfere with that nitrogen-fixing bacteria we talked about earlier, which can leave your beans stunted and struggling instead of thriving. All right, we are getting close to harvest, but before we go there, if this kind of small space system is something you want to see more of, now is a great time to hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And again, I would love to know where you are watching from today, so drop that in the comments below. I read every single one. Now here is the part that really determines whether your beans turn out sweet and tender or flat and starchy, and it has almost nothing to do with which variety you planted. It comes down entirely to timing. Inside every bean pod, sweetness comes from natural sugars, and those sugar levels are highest when the pod is still young, roughly the thickness of a pencil. As a pod keeps growing past that point and gets larger and older, the plant starts converting those sweet sugars into starch to feed the developing seeds inside. The sweetness you were hopping for quietly disappears the longer that pod hangs on the vine. So the real secret to consistently sweet, crisp beans is simple. Harvest often, roughly every 2 to 5 days. And always pick on the smaller side rather than waiting for pods to get big and impressive looking. Every time you pick, you are also signaling the plant to keep producing more flowers to replace what you just took, which is exactly what keeps this whole system continuous instead of a one-time event. There is one more layer to this that most people never hear about, and once you know it, you will notice it every single season. Even if you pick a pod at that exact same perfect young size later in the year, it will not taste quite as sweet as one picked early on from the same plant. As the plant itself ages over the course of the season, something shifts internally, and its sugar production naturally declines a bit with time. So pods from later harvests trend slightly less sweet than the very first ones, even when they look identical in size and appearance. It is not something you did wrong, and it is not a sign the plant is struggling. It is just the plant's natural rhythm playing out, the same way a lot of produce shifts in flavor as a growing season moves along. Knowing this ahead of time just helps set the right expectations. So if you notice your beans mellow out a touch by late summer compared to that first incredible batch back in early summer, you will understand exactly why, and you can appreciate that first flush of harvest for the genuinely special moment it is. When harvest time actually comes, try to pick in the early morning if you can. The pods are at their crispest and most hydrated then, before the heat of the day starts pulling moisture out of them, and honestly they just snap off the vine easier when they are cool and firm like that. Hold the vine gently with one hand near the stem while you pull the pod free with the other, so you are not putting stress on the whole plant every time you harvest. And this is the real payoff of the whole setup. Instead of one big harvest and then an empty trellis staring back at you for the rest of the summer, you are walking out every few days to a fresh handful, then a fresh basket, then another one a few days after that. Some weeks you will be picking almost daily once the plant really hits its stride. The vine just keeps giving as long as you keep picking, which is the entire promise behind this system, and it is a completely different experience from a bush planting where you harvest once, preserve what you can, and then wait for next season to start over. Once you have more beans than you can eat right away, and with a productive pole variety, that will happen. A little post-harvest care goes a long way in keeping that sweetness intact. If you are eating them within a few days, store the unwashed pods in the refrigerator, ideally in a perforated bag so they get airflow, and keep them cold and humid rather than dry. Just be careful not to let them sit right against the coldest part of the fridge for too long, since beans are sensitive to chilling injury and can develop soft, water-soaked spots if they get too cold for too long. If you are looking at a bigger surplus you want to keep for months, freezing is the way to go, and it is much simpler than people expect. Trim the ends off the pods, drop them into rapidly boiling water for just a couple of minutes to blanch them, then immediately transfer them into a bowl of ice water to stop the cooking process right in its tracks. That quick blanch and shock is what locks in the color, the texture, and most importantly the sweetness, since skipping this step and freezing beans raw tends to leave you with mushy, dull-tasting pods once you thaw them later. Once they are drained and thoroughly dried, pack them into airtight freezer bags, pressing out as much air as you can before sealing. Done this way, you can hold on to that sweetness and snap for months down the line, which means a productive plant like this does not just feed you today. It can genuinely carry you well into the off-season too, long after the trellis has come down for the year. One more small thing worth mentioning, while we are on the topic of keeping your plants healthy through all of this. Because container growing means everything is packed a bit closer together, humidity can build up around the leaves more easily than it would in an open garden bed. Try to water at the soil level rather than spraying the foliage, and avoid handling the vines or picking pods while the leaves are still wet from rain or morning dew. Damp leaves are exactly how certain bacterial issues spread from plant to plant, so keeping the foliage dry as much as possible is a simple habit that protects your harvest without costing you anything extra. That is the full system, a fabric container built for drainage and root health, a climbing variety chosen specifically for its ability to keep producing, an inoculation step most people skip that gives the roots a real head start, a vertical support built early to avoid disturbing the roots later, a feeding approach that protects flowering instead of accidentally shutting it down, and a harvest rhythm that keeps both the sweetness and the production going all the way through the season. If you found this useful, Subscribe for more small space growing that is actually built to keep producing, not just look nice for a week and fade out. And before you go, I would really love to hear from you, so drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from today. Thanks for growing along